The surveillance room was colder than the rest of the penthouse. Not because of temperature, because of intention. Eo Dong-sun sat alone in a leather chair bolted to the floor, 3 stories above the streets of Seoul, surrounded by silent men who did not speak unless spoken to. The walls were black glass. The air smelled faintly of metal and antiseptic. In front of him, a curved wall of monitors glowed like a living organism, 12 camera feeds, all locked on a single room. His mother's room? A private medical suite disguised as comfort, soft lighting, imported linens, equipment so advanced it made most hospitals look outdated. Everything money could buy, everything control could enforce. Nothing that seemed to help. The narrator's voice settled in, low and steady. 27 caregivers in 30 days. 27 women hired, monitored, dismissed. Some fired quietly. Some escorted out in the middle of the night. A few never asked for references again. Not because they were cruel, because they followed orders. Doctors came and went like royalty. Their credentials framed on the wall. Their voices confident. Their conclusions identical. Her condition is declining as expected. At her age, this is normal. We're doing everything medically possible. Dong-sun had nodded through all of it, signed checks, approved treatments, increased security, and watched. He watched because watching was how he survived. Before we dive deeper into this story, let us know where you're watching from, and if you're new here, click on the subscribe button to never miss any of our upcoming videos. On the screens, his mother lay still beneath white sheets, her breathing shallow but steady. The woman who raised him alone after his father vanished into debt and violence. The woman who had slapped his hand the first time he brought blood into her house. The woman who once told him, "Power doesn't protect you from consequences, it only delays them." Now she barely opened her eyes. A new feed flickered. Camera 7. The door opened. The quiet maid stepped inside. She was older than the others. Not elderly, just past the age where people noticed you. Dark uniform. Hair pulled back tightly. No jewelry. No perfume. Her file had been thin. No glowing recommendations. No prestigious hospitals. Which was why she'd been approved. Invisible people caused fewer problems. She moved without hesitation. No nervous glances at the corners where the cameras were hidden. No stiff posture meant to impress. She washed her hands slowly, checked the IV drip, adjusted the pillow beneath Dong-sun's mother's neck with careful precision. She spoke softly, not to the cameras, to the woman in the bed. Dong-sun leaned forward slightly. Most caregivers spoke about his mother. Vital signs, schedules, charts. This one spoke to her. "How are we feeling today?" The maid murmured, voice calm, almost familiar. "Still tired? I know. I would be too." She checked the monitors, heart rate, oxygen levels, temperature. Her brow tightened just slightly, so slight most people would have missed it. Dong-sun didn't. She pulled the blanket higher, tucking it around the older woman's shoulders like she was warding off a draft that machines couldn't sense. Then she reached for the medication tray. 6 small bottles, clear labels, precise dosages, prescribed, approved, paid for. She picked one up, paused. The surveillance room held its breath. The maid uncapped the bottle and brought it to her nose. She sniffed. Once, twice. Her expression didn't change, but her hand stilled. Dong-sun's head of security shifted his weight. "Sir," he murmured, already reaching for his phone. On screen, the maid didn't hesitate. She walked to the trash bin and dumped the entire bottle inside. Liquid splashed softly against plastic. The room exploded into motion. "Remove her," someone said. Now, the security chief's phone was already dialing. Dong-sun didn't move. On screen, the maid returned to the bedside, removed the IV line with practiced ease, and replaced it with saline. She adjusted the flow, checked the mother's breathing again. Then she did something no one else had done in 30 days. She looked up, directly into the camera, not past it, at it. Her eyes were steady, not defiant, not afraid. "Certain, whatever you're giving her," she said calmly, her voice cutting clean through the audio feed. "It's making her worse." The room went silent. Dong-sun's jaw tightened. No one spoke to him like that. Not doctors, not staff, not family. The maid continued. "You can fire me like the others," she said, her tone respectful but unyielding. "Or you can let me stop it for one night and see if I'm wrong." The security chief's finger hovered over the call button. Dongsun raised his hand. Wait. The word landed like a commandment. He stood. The chair scraped softly against the floor. On the monitors, the maid adjusted the blankets again, smoothing wrinkles with a tenderness that didn't belong in a room like this. She held the older woman's hand, thin, fragile, and rubbed small circles into her palm. The mother stirred. Just slightly. Enough to be noticed. Enough to matter. Dongsun didn't look back at the screens. He walked toward the door. Do you think she just signed her death warrant? Or saved a life? Seoul never slept. It pretended to lights dimmed, streets emptied, trains slowed, but beneath the surface, the city breathed like a living thing. Deals were made after midnight. Debts were collected before dawn. Power shifted not in offices, but in quiet rooms where no records were kept. And at the center of that invisible map sat Eo Dong-sundae, not a politician, not a celebrity, not a man whose name appeared in headlines. A force. The narrator's voice pulled the story backward, away from the humming surveillance room, away from the sickbed, into the city that made him. Dongsun didn't inherit power. He took it. Seoul's underground wasn't a single organization, it was a layered ecosystem. Old families with bloodlines going back generations. New money syndicates built on construction, shipping, entertainment. Street crews who believed loyalty mattered until it didn't. Police units that understood the difference between law and order. Dongsun learned early that fear was cheaper than loyalty and more reliable. He started as leverage, then enforcement, then arbitration. He didn't shout, didn't posture. He listened longer than everyone else in the room, then spoke once. When he moved, it was final. No spectacle, no warnings. People didn't fear him because he was violent. They feared him because he was precise. By the time he reached his 30s, half the city's shadow economy ran through companies that didn't list him anywhere. Shell corporations, medical supply chains, real estate trusts, private security firms staffed by men who knew how to disappear. The penthouse came later, at the top of a steel and glass tower overlooking the Han River. Dongsun built what looked like luxury and functioned like a bunker. Reinforced walls, private elevators, emergency power systems independent from the grid, a medical wing that rivaled boutique hospitals. It wasn't indulgence. It was insurance. Because power, he understood, didn't make you untouchable. It made you visible. And the only place he ever felt exposed was not in meetings, or negotiations, or late-night drives through hostile territory. It was with his mother. She lived with him not because she asked to, but because he refused to let her live anywhere else. She had raised him alone. His father had vanished early, swallowed by debt and desperation. What remained was a small apartment, a tired woman, and a boy who learned very quickly that weakness invited consequences. She worked 2 jobs, cleaned offices at night, cooked meals from whatever was left at the market. When Dongsun came home bruised, she didn't ask who hit him. She asked what he learned. When he stole for the first time, she made him return it. When he lied, she didn't punish him. She told him lies were a debt that always came due. As he grew older and colder, she remained unchanged. She never asked where the money came from. Never asked why men bowed their heads when he entered a room. Never pretended she didn't know what he had become. But she also never feared him. She was the only person who could look at him and say, "This will cost you," without consequences. And for years, he let her, even as he ignored her warnings. When the illness came, it didn't announce itself dramatically. No collapse, no emergency, just fatigue, missed steps, forgetting small things. Doctors used soft language, age-related decline, manageable, slow progression. Dongsun responded the only way he knew how. He bought solutions. Specialists flown in from abroad, equipment installed overnight, medications sourced privately, a rotating staff of caregivers, each vetted, each monitored, each instructed to follow protocol without deviation. The penthouse transformed. What had once been minimalist luxury became clinical precision. A hospital wing built inside a home. White floors that reflected light too sharply. Machines that hummed constantly, like a reminder that time was passing even when no one spoke. Doctors deferred to Dongsun even when they pretended not to. They used careful phrasing. They avoided certainty. They understood who signed their checks. And they all said the same thing. Her decline is expected. Each time, Dongsun nodded. Each time, his mother grew weaker. She slept more, ate less, spoke in shorter sentences. Sometimes, she stared at him like she was trying to place a familiar face from a fading memory. That terrified him more than any enemy ever had. So he watched. He installed cameras not because he distrusted the staff, but because he distrusted reality. Because watching made him feel involved. Because control, to him, had always been protection. From his office, he watched doctors adjust equipment, caregivers administer medication, nurses chart vitals with neat handwriting and careful neutrality. Everything was being done correctly, and nothing was improving. One afternoon, a senior physician stood at the foot of the bed, tablet in hand, voice smooth and detached. At this stage, comfort is the priority, he said. Aggressive intervention may cause unnecessary distress. Dong-sun didn't raise his voice. He simply asked, "Is she dying?" The doctor hesitated. "That's difficult to predict." Dong-sun smiled thinly. "Then, predict improvement." Silence. The doctor nodded, understanding the warning, and left. Later that evening, Dong-sun sat beside his mother's bed. The machines reflected faint green light onto her skin. She looked small, fragile, nothing like the woman who had once stood between him and the world. "You built all this?" she whispered suddenly, eyes still closed. "Yes," he said. "For me?" she asked. "For you," he answered without hesitation. Her lips curved faintly. "You always did confuse control with care." The words landed heavier than any threat. She slept again. He stayed. That night, from the surveillance room, he watched another caregiver follow instructions perfectly. Administer medication on time, avoid unnecessary contact, maintain professional distance. His mother didn't stir. The caregiver was dismissed the next morning. By the time the quiet maid arrived older, unassuming, invisible, Dong-sun was no longer looking for kindness. He was looking for results. He believed obedience kept his mother safe. He believed observation equaled protection. He believed power could substitute for trust. And as he stood now, walking toward the medical suite, summoned by a woman who had just thrown his authority into a trash bin, he was about to learn how wrong he'd been. She arrived before dawn. No entourage, no nervous chatter, no unnecessary questions at the security gate. Just a woman in a plain dark coat, standing straight, hands folded calmly in front of her, as if she had been there many times before, even though the record said she hadn't. Her name barely registered, not because it was fake, because it didn't matter. The hiring officer glanced at her file twice, then once more, as if expecting the missing pages to appear. No prestigious hospitals, no influential references, no glowing letters, just short-term positions, care work, elder support, night shifts, gaps that weren't explained. "Why were you let go from your last position?" the officer asked, already bored. The woman lowered her eyes respectfully. "They didn't need me anymore," she said. That was all. No begging, no story, no fear leaking into her voice. Most applicants tried to sell themselves. Some overdid it, too many compliments, too much gratitude, too eager to please. They bowed too deeply, spoke too quickly, promised obedience before it was asked for. This woman did none of that. She waited. Silence stretched. The officer tapped the folder, annoyed by how little there was to reject her with. "Rules here are strict," he said. "No improvisation, no independent decisions. No, I understand," she said quietly, before he finished. She didn't look up when she spoke, not out of submission but habit. Silence, she knew, was survival. The elevator ride up was wordless. She stood still as it climbed, eyes forward, posture relaxed but alert. The security guard beside her kept glancing sideways, unsettled by how unbothered she seemed. Everyone else who rode this elevator fidgeted, adjusted their clothes, asked questions. She simply breathed. When the doors opened onto the penthouse level, the difference was immediate. The air changed. It smelled clean in a way that felt deliberate, not comforting, controlled. White floors stretched out beneath soft lighting. Cameras hid behind architectural lines. Armed security blended seamlessly into the decor. This was not a home. It was a command center, pretending to be one. She was led through corridors that grew quieter the deeper they went. The medical wing revealed itself not with signs, but with sound, the steady hum of machines, the measured beeping of monitors, the faint hiss of oxygen. She slowed slightly, not in fear, in attention. Other caregivers, she noticed, moved too fast here, too loudly. Shoes clicking, voices rising unnecessarily. They tried to show usefulness through motion. She did the opposite. She moved like she belonged. The supervising nurse rattled off instructions as they walked. Vitals every hour. Medication strictly on schedule. No deviation without approval. No emotional engagement. No. I know, the maid said softly. Again, no eye contact. Again, no resistance. The nurse frowned. You've worked in places like this before? Yes, the maid answered. The nurse didn't ask where. They entered the room. The sick woman lay beneath white sheets, her face pale, skin thin as paper. Machines surrounded her like quiet sentinels. Tubes ran where comfort should have been. The maid stopped at the threshold. She didn't rush forward. She looked, really looked. The way her chest rose, the way her hands curled slightly inward, the faint tension at the corners of her mouth. Pain, controlled. The nurse mistook the pause for hesitation. Don't worry, she said briskly. She's not responsive most of the time. The maid nodded, but her eyes lingered on the woman's face. Responsiveness, she knew, wasn't always obvious. She washed her hands carefully, too carefully to be nervous. Every movement deliberate, every step measured. She checked the IV line without being told, adjusted the pillow just enough to change the angle of the woman's neck. The machines continued their steady rhythm. The nurse watched, arms crossed. Most people get overwhelmed the first day, she said. You're allowed to ask questions. The maid shook her head slightly. I'll observe, she said. That answer should have been reassuring. It wasn't. By mid-morning, the maid had learned everything she needed to know without asking a single question. She watched which caregivers were nervous near the cameras, which ones exaggerated politeness when doctors entered, which instructions were followed out of habit, not logic. She learned that silence here wasn't encouraged, it was enforced. During medication rounds, she noticed something small, not dramatic, not obvious. A bottle on the tray, clear liquid, correct label, proper dosage. But when she held it up to the light, the way the liquid clung to the glass felt wrong. She didn't react. She administered nothing. She placed the bottle back exactly where it had been. Said nothing. She needed this job. Not because it paid well, but because leaving would raise questions. And questions, in a place like this, were dangerous. She understood the man who owned this place without ever seeing him. The cameras told her everything. This was a house where obedience was mistaken for loyalty, where silence was currency, where mistakes weren't corrected, they were erased. She would not survive by being loud. She would survive by being right. That night, as the lights dimmed and the medical wing settled into its artificial quiet, she stood beside the bed and watched the woman's breathing slow, unevenly. She reached out, placed 2 fingers gently on the woman's wrist. Too faint. Her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Something was wrong. She knew it, but she said nothing. Not yet. Dong Sun stood behind the glass wall of the surveillance room, hands clasped behind his back, posture perfectly still. From here, the penthouse looked different, stripped of luxury, reduced to angles. 27 screens glowed in front of him, each one a window into obedience. Hallways, elevators, stairwells. The private medical suite split into 4 separate feeds. Wide shot, bed level, corner angle, ceiling-mounted lens that saw everything and missed nothing. Audio feeds hummed softly through the speakers, calibrated to pick up breath, fabric movement, the faintest change in tone. This was how Dong Sun preferred the world. Quiet, ordered, predictable. A subordinate adjusted the levels without being asked. He knew better than to speak. On the largest screen, the maid moved slowly across the medical suite. She didn't rush. That alone marked her as different. Most caregivers moved like they were performing for an unseen audience, quick steps, exaggerated efficiency, constant glances toward the corners of the room where the lenses hid. They wanted to be seen working, wanted approval they would never receive. This woman did not look at the cameras. Not once. Dong Sun leaned forward slightly, eyes narrowing. Zoom, he said. The technician complied immediately. The image tightened, focus sharpened. The maid stood beside the bed, shoulders relaxed, breathing steady. She adjusted the blanket with care, smoothing a crease no one else would bother with. She checked the monitor, then placed 2 fingers on the older woman's wrist. Not for show, for confirmation. Doctors didn't do that. Doctors trusted machines. Dong Sun had paid a fortune for those machines. Yet here she was, ignoring the hierarchy completely. He should have corrected it. He didn't. The maid spoke softly, her voice barely louder than breath. The audio feed struggled to catch it. "I'm here," she said. Not loud enough for the room, loud enough for the woman in the bed. Dong-sun felt a faint irritation crawl up his spine. Caregivers were instructed not to speak unless necessary. Conversation was considered inefficient. Emotional engagement invited complications. The woman on the bed did not respond. The maid didn't seem to expect her to. She continued anyway. "It's morning," she said quietly. "The light is different today." Dong-sun glanced at the timestamp. She was right. Sunlight filtered through the sheer curtains at a low angle, pale and indirect. No one else had mentioned it. No one else had cared. The maid took the woman's hand. That was new. Dong-sun's jaw tightened. Physical contact beyond functional necessity was discouraged. He had made that clear. Touch created attachment. Attachment created vulnerability. And vulnerability got people hurt. Yet the maid's hand rested lightly over the older woman's fingers. Not gripping, not possessive, just present. The monitors showed a slight change in the woman's breathing. Almost imperceptible. The technician noticed it too. He glanced at Dong-sun, then quickly looked back at the screens. Dong-sun said nothing. He watched. The maid adjusted the pillow again, this time angling it to ease the woman's neck. She wiped the corners of her mouth gently with a cloth, then paused. She looked at the medication tray. The camera caught the shift in her posture. Interest, focus. Dong-sun felt it then, that subtle tightening in his chest that came when something unexpected entered his system. She lifted one bottle, read the label, checked the chart on the tablet mounted beside the bed, set the bottle down, lifted another. She didn't rush. She didn't frown. She didn't react in any visible way, but Dong-sun noticed the smallest detail. She read the schedule twice. Most caregivers memorized it on day one and followed it like scripture. This woman studied it like a puzzle. "She's thorough," one of the aides murmured from the back of the room, forgetting himself. Dong-sun didn't turn. "Thorough is not the same as obedient," he said. The aide swallowed and went silent. On screen, the maid pulled a chair closer to the bed and sat. That was a violation. Care staff were not to sit unless performing a task. Sitting implied time. Time implied permission. Dong-sun felt the old instinct rise, the urge to correct, to reassert the rules, to remind everyone that nothing in this penthouse happened without his approval. Instead, he folded his arms and watched. The maid spoke again, barely audible. "They keep the room too cold," she said. She reached for the thermostat without hesitation and adjusted it by a single degree. Dong-sun's eyes flicked to the data feed. Temperature change registered. No alarm sounded. She shouldn't have known she could do that. Someone had shown her, or she had simply assumed she could. Both possibilities irritated him. And yet, the woman on the bed shifted slightly. Not much. Just enough to register comfort. Dong-sun exhaled slowly through his nose. He remembered other caregivers. Their chatter, their forced cheer, their constant need for reassurance. They treated his mother like a problem to be managed, not a person enduring something unbearable. This maid treated her like someone still present. It was inefficient. It was dangerous. It was effective. Hours passed. Dong-sun did not leave the room. Meetings were postponed. Calls went unanswered. His men learned to adapt when his attention shifted. They always did. The maid moved through her tasks with quiet precision. She cleaned without noise. She checked vitals without drama. She spoke sparingly, always in the same low tone, always to the woman, not to the cameras, not to him. At one point, she paused near the foot of the bed and stood still for a long moment. Dong-sun leaned forward again. "What is she doing?" The technician whispered. "Thinking," Dong-sun replied. The maid picked up the medication chart again. This time, she traced the times with her finger. Morning, afternoon, night. Her lips pressed together slightly. She compared it to the bottles, checked the labels again. The smallest shake of her head, so subtle it would have gone unnoticed by anyone else. Dong-sun noticed. His heart rate increased, just enough for the biometric watch on his wrist to register it. "What does she see?" he muttered. No one answered. On screen, the maid placed the bottles back on the tray, aligning them with care. She did not administer anything yet. She sat back down, waited. Dong-sun stared at the screens, a strange sensation settling over him. This woman was not afraid of his rules. She wasn't challenging them either. She was operating outside of them. That was more dangerous than defiance. He should have intervened. He should have summoned her, reminded her who controlled this space, who decided who stayed, and who vanished from the payroll without explanation. Instead, he did nothing. He watched as she leaned closer to his mother and spoke again, voice steady. "I'll be careful," she said. "I promise." Dong-sun didn't know who she was speaking to. The woman in the bed, or the man behind the glass. The camera feed held steady on her face as she reached for the medication schedule one last time, eyes scanning every line with quiet intensity. Dong-sun felt the shift then. The balance wasn't tipping yet, but it had moved. And once things moved in his world, they rarely returned to where they started. Dong-sun stood in the surveillance room like a man standing in a church, not praying, observing. The glass wall in front of him was thick enough to hold back bullets. The cameras on the ceiling of the room itself were angled, as if they were worshipping him. The air was cold, filtered, and still like the room was sealed from the rest of the world, and from time itself. 27 screens glowed in front of him, arranged in a grid that looked like a chessboard. Each screen showed a different angle of the penthouse, the main hallway, the private elevator, the security gate, the kitchen, and the medical suite where his mother lay. But his eyes were fixed on one, a room inside a room, a private medical suite that was, in every sense, a fortress. The camera feeds were crisp, almost clinical. One wide-angle lens captured the entire room. Another sat near the ceiling, giving a bird's-eye view. A third was positioned at bed level, angled to catch even the smallest movement. The fourth was closer, capturing facial expressions and tiny changes in breathing. The audio feed hummed quietly in the background, tuned to pick up the faintest sound. A breath, the rustle of fabric, the click of a nurse's shoes. Dong-sun didn't need the audio to know what was happening. He could feel it. His mother was not just sick. She was being watched. He had made sure of that. He had made sure everyone was watched. That was how he controlled things. Not with fear alone, with information, with surveillance, with the quiet, constant reminder that no one was ever truly alone. He turned slightly, watching the technician at the console. The man was young, nervous, and obedient, two traits. Dong-sun, rewarded with silence. "Any change?" Dong-sun asked. The technician shook his head, eyes fixed on the screens. "No, sir, no change." Dong-sun didn't respond. He watched the maid move in the medical suite. She was different from the others. The others had been loud, too eager, too anxious. They spoke in polite tones that carried over the audio. They smiled when the cameras were on. They tried to perform the role of caregiver like an actress playing a part. This woman did none of that. She moved slowly, deliberately, as if the room itself demanded a certain respect. She approached the bed without looking at the cameras. That was the first thing that made Dong-sun's attention sharpen. Most people, in a room like this, looked for the eyes that weren't there. She did not. She looked at the patient. The older woman lay still under the white sheets, her face pale and hollow. The machines beside her made a constant, mechanical rhythm, beeps and hums that were meant to be comforting but sounded more like a countdown. The maid stood at the bedside, hands folded in front of her, taking a moment to observe. Not a glance, a study. Then she reached out and touched the woman's hand. It was a simple gesture, a human one, a dangerous one. Dong-sun's eyes narrowed. Doctors didn't touch her like that. Nurses didn't touch her like that. They treated her like a body to be managed. This woman treated her like a person. The audio feed picked up the soft sound of her voice. "I'm here," she said. Her voice was quiet, almost a whisper. Not for the camera, not for the staff, for the woman. Dong-sun felt something shift in his chest. It was not anger. It was confusion. He had never seen anyone speak to his mother like she was still present. He had never seen anyone act as if she could still hear him. He leaned closer to the screen. The maid lifted the woman's wrist and checked her pulse. Her fingers were steady. Her touch was gentle. She didn't rush. She didn't act like she was afraid of the consequences. The maid spoke again, softer this time. "You don't have to be afraid," she said. Dong-sun's breath caught, not because of what she said, but because of what it implied. Who was she to say that? Who was she to offer comfort? The maid adjusted the blanket, smoothing the fabric with a calm precision that looked practiced. She moved the pillow slightly, repositioning the woman's head to a more comfortable angle. Then she glanced toward the medication tray. The camera captured her pause. She didn't reach for the medication right away. She didn't move with the urgency that most caregivers displayed when they were watched. Instead, she studied the tray as if it were a map. She read the labels carefully. She looked at the schedule on the clipboard. She compared the times and dosages with the chart on the wall. She was not just following orders. She was analyzing them. Dongsun's mouth tightened. He had trained himself to never show weakness. He had built an empire on it. He had eliminated men who hesitated. He had eliminated women who questioned. But this maid wasn't questioning out loud. She was questioning in silence. That was more dangerous. The technician cleared his throat. "She's studying the schedule," he said, voice small. Dongsun didn't answer. He continued watching as the maid moved closer to the bedside table and picked up the medication chart. Her eyes scanned every line. Her lips moved slightly as if she was counting silently. Then she lifted her head and looked at the mother again. Not at the cameras. At the woman. The maid's face remained calm. No fear. No panic. Just quiet focus. Dongsun felt a familiar sensation. The urge to intervene, to assert control, to remind the world that he was the one who decided what happened in his mother's room. He stood still. He did not move. He did not speak. He watched her study the medication schedule closely, as if she was looking for something he didn't want her to find. And the more he watched, the more he realized the truth he had been avoiding since she entered the room. This woman was not here to obey. She was here to understand. The penthouse was quieter at night, but not peaceful. The security team reduced their movements. The cameras kept working. The machines in the medical suite kept their steady rhythm. The city outside Seoul continued to breathe, unaware of the violence hiding behind the glass walls of a luxury home. Inside, the air was heavy. The maid moved with the same calm precision she had shown all day. But now the room felt different, darker, smaller. The shadows seemed to press closer to the corners of the ceiling. She checked the vitals again. Then again, the numbers didn't change. They barely moved. But something in her expression tightened. Not panic, recognition. She opened the medication cabinet. The bottles sat neatly, aligned like soldiers. Labels facing outward. Dosages written in black marker. Times in red. She reached for the bottle she had studied earlier. She held it up to the light. The liquid inside shimmered slightly. Too clear, too smooth. She glanced at the chart. Then she did something no caregiver in that house had ever done before. She opened the bottle. She lifted it to her lips. Not enough to drink, just a small taste. The sound of the liquid slipping into her mouth was barely audible through the audio feed. Dongsun was watching. He wasn't supposed to be awake. He hadn't moved from the surveillance room since the maid arrived. He had told himself he was merely observing, keeping watch, protecting his mother. But he was awake because he couldn't sleep. He was awake because he was afraid. And now, as he watched the maid taste the medication, he felt a cold shock of anger. The maid's face remained neutral for a moment. Then her eyes widened slightly. Her lips parted. A faint tremor shook her hand. She set the bottle down gently, as if it were fragile. Her breathing quickened. She leaned forward and grabbed the woman's wrist again. This time, she pressed her fingers harder, as if she needed to confirm something. The audio feed captured her whisper. "Oh no," she said. Not loud, not dramatic, just a quiet acknowledgement of the truth. Dongsun's jaw clenched. He watched as she reached for the bottle again, then hesitated. Her eyes flicked to the cameras. For a moment, she looked directly into the lens. Her face was calm. Her gaze was steady. But the look in her eyes was not obedience. It was decision. She tipped the bottle over the sink. The liquid poured out slowly, the sound muffled by the room's silence. Then she took a cup of water from the counter and filled the bottle again. She set it down, not replacing the medication, but filling the container with something harmless. Water. Plain water. She did not waste time. She moved quickly, but not hurriedly. She adjusted the mother's oxygen mask, checked the tubes, and then moved to the bedside table where a manual blood pressure cuff lay. The machines were designed to do everything, but the maid was not waiting for machines. She placed the cuff around the mother's arm, inflated it, and read the numbers herself. Then she adjusted the woman's position, placing a small pillow under her knees, lifting her head slightly, and smoothing the sheet. She spoke softly. "Easy," she whispered. "Just breathe." The mother's chest rose and fell more steadily. The maid's hands moved like she had done this 1,000 times before. Not as a nurse. As someone who knew what it meant to keep someone alive without permission, Dong Sun felt the urge to explode, to storm into the room, to pull the maid out by the collar, to remind her of his power. He could fire her. He could punish her. He could make her disappear. He could do anything. But he didn't move. He stayed behind the glass. He watched. Because he couldn't deny what he was seeing, the mother's breathing became more even. The numbers on the screen began to stabilize. A slight improvement. A small change. A change that should not have been possible. The maid continued to work. She held the mother's hand again. Not because it was part of the job, because she wanted the woman to know she wasn't alone. The machines hummed. The camera angles remained the same. But the room felt different now. Not because of the medicine, because of the fact that the maid had chosen to defy the system, to replace the prescribed medication with water, to stabilize the mother manually, to refuse to let the rules decide what was best for a human being. Dong Sun's mind raced. Protocol versus instinct. Control versus truth. He had built his empire on the idea that he was the one who decided what was real. Now, a quiet maid had challenged that, and he couldn't deny the result. The mother's breathing grew softer. Her face relaxed slightly. Her body, for the first time in weeks, seemed to surrender to rest. The maid watched her for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then she looked up at the camera, not with fear, with certainty. She had done what she had to do. Dong Sun remained behind the glass, watching the screen, watching the woman sleep more peacefully than she had in weeks. His mother's room was no longer just a place of surveillance. It had become a place of choice. And he realized, with a slow, heavy dread, that he was no longer the only one making choices in his own house. The night had a way of changing the penthouse. During the day, it was a fortress, a controlled space where everything had a purpose and every movement was recorded. At night, it became a quiet place where secrets grew teeth. The city of Seoul continued outside, bright and loud and alive. But inside the penthouse, the only sound was the steady hum of machines and the faint breath of someone who could not speak back. Dong Sun sat alone in the surveillance room. The screens were the only light. The camera feeds were still on. The audio was still active. Everything was still watching. But the difference was that he wasn't watching out of duty anymore. He was watching out of something that felt much worse. Curiosity. And guilt. On the largest screen, the maid sat beside his mother's bed. She had been there for hours. Her posture was still, her hands folded in her lap, her head bowed slightly. She spoke softly. Not to anyone in the room. Not to the cameras. To the woman who couldn't respond. The audio feed picked up her words as if they were being whispered through the walls. "I shouldn't be here," she said. Her voice was quiet, almost trembling. The kind of voice that only appears when someone has been holding something inside for too long. The maid leaned closer to the bed. She brushed a strand of hair away from the mother's forehead. Her fingers lingered for a moment. Then she spoke again. "I didn't want to hurt you," she said. Dong Sun's heart tightened. He hadn't expected to hear confession in his mother's room. He hadn't expected to hear remorse. The maid continued, her voice steadying as she spoke. "I've made mistakes," she said. "I've done things I'm not proud of, but I didn't come here to make another one." She paused. Her breath hitched. "I don't know if you can hear me," she said, voice breaking slightly. "But I want you to know something. The way they've been treating you, it's not care. It's control." Dong Sun's hand clenched into a fist behind his back. He could feel his own breath become shallow. He watched the maid's face on the screen. She wasn't looking at the cameras. She wasn't looking at him. She was speaking to the woman in the bed. And somehow, it felt like she was speaking to him too. The maid's voice dropped even lower. "I'm scared," she admitted. "I'm scared of what will happen if I'm caught. I'm scared of what happens if I do nothing. But I'm more scared of living in a world where you're treated like a machine." Dong Sun's eyes burned. He had never wanted to be seen. He had never wanted anyone to know his thoughts. But now, the maid was saying them out loud. In his own home, the audio feed captured a soft sigh from the mother's chest. It was barely noticeable, but it was there. A small shift, a sign of life. The maid's eyes widened. She leaned closer and placed her hand on the mother's chest, just above the heart. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm sorry it took me so long to see you as a person." Dong Sun felt something in him loosen. Not compassion. Not forgiveness. Something else. A sudden awareness that he had been wrong. The maid continued, her voice becoming steadier again. I know who you are, she said. I know what you did. I know what you built, and I know what you're trying to protect. Dong Sun's breath caught. He didn't move. He couldn't. The maid was speaking about him, not directly, but indirectly, as if she could feel the weight of his presence behind the glass. She spoke as if she had known him for years. You built an empire, she said, and you did it because you were scared. You were scared of being powerless. You were scared of being alone. You were scared of being the kind of man people could hurt. Dong Sun's eyes flicked to the screen. He saw the maid's face soften, not because she respected him, because she understood him. The audio feed picked up a soft sound, a small sniff, a breath that seemed to tremble. The maid's voice dropped again. I'm not here to save you, she said. I'm here to save her. Dong Sun felt the room tilt. For the first time, he realized the truth of what he had built. He had created a world where his mother was not a person. She was a possession, a symbol, a weakness. And now, because of this maid, he was forced to confront the fact that he had never actually protected her. He had only controlled her. The maid leaned closer to the bed again. She whispered one last thing. I don't want to be your enemy, she said. But I won't be your puppet either. Then she sat back, silent. The audio feed picked up the quiet rustle of fabric as she adjusted the blanket. Dong Sun sat very still. He watched her, not because he wanted to see what she would do next, but because he was afraid of what he might feel if he looked away. The room was quiet. The city outside continued. The cameras continued, but something had changed. The surveillance was no longer just surveillance. It had become intimacy, a confession, a betrayal, a truth that could not be unseen. Dong Sun didn't move from behind the glass. He didn't turn off the monitors. He didn't call security. He just watched and listened and realized that the person he had been watching was not just a maid. She was the only person in the room who was brave enough to speak the truth. The morning light in the penthouse was never soft. It was always sharp, as if the sun itself was being filtered through the glass walls, sharpened into something clinical and unforgiving. Dong Sun entered the medical suite without knocking. The door opened quietly, no grand announcement, no flourish. Just the sound of a lock disengaging and a man who expected obedience walking into a room that was supposed to be his. The first thing he noticed was the sound. The monitors. The beeping that usually sounded like a countdown. This time, the rhythm was steadier. Slower. More consistent. It wasn't the sound of decline. It was the sound of stabilization. His mother lay on the bed with her eyes closed, but her chest rose and fell with a calmness he hadn't heard in weeks. Dong Sun's gaze snapped to the nurse's station. The doctor on duty stood there, staring at the monitors with a confusion that was almost visible. Her vitals, the doctor began, voice unsure. The nurse beside him shook her head. We've never seen this, she said. Dong Sun didn't respond. He stepped closer to the bed, eyes narrowed, and looked at his mother's face. She looked different, not healthier, not recovered. Just calmer, like someone who had stopped fighting. He turned slowly to the maid. She stood near the foot of the bed, hands folded, posture relaxed. She didn't look guilty. She didn't look afraid. She looked like someone who had done what she believed was right. Dong Sun's voice was cold. What did you do? He asked. The maid didn't flinch. She didn't speak immediately. She simply looked at the monitors again, as if she wanted to make sure the numbers were real. Then she turned to him. I did what I could, she said. Dong Sun stepped closer. The air between them felt charged. He could have ordered her out. He could have called security. He could have had her removed without a word. But he didn't. He watched her, because he needed to know what she was capable of. The doctor cleared his throat. Sir, he said, trying to sound confident, there's no medical explanation for this sudden improvement. It's possible. Dong Sun cut him off with a sharp look. Possible what? He asked. The doctor hesitated. Possible the medication was adjusted, he said. Possible there was a change in dosage. Dong Sun turned his gaze back to the maid. Her expression remained calm. Tell him, Dong Sun said. The maid nodded slightly. She took a step forward, then spoke with a clarity that surprised him. The medication she's been given is making her worse, she said. The room went silent. Even the machines seemed to pause. The doctor's eyes widened. That's a serious accusation, he said. The maid didn't look at him. She looked at Dong Sunday. I'm not accusing you, she said. I'm accusing the medication. Or the people who are giving it to her. Dongsun's jaw tightened. He felt the urge to snap at her, to remind her of her place, but the truth was hitting him too hard. He had never considered that the medicine could be the problem. He had assumed the doctors knew what they were doing. He had assumed his mother's decline was inevitable. The maid continued. She was reacting to it, she said, voice steady. She was getting worse every day. The medicine was too strong. The schedule was too frequent. She was being given drugs that didn't fit her condition. The doctor stepped forward, defensive. That's not possible, he said. The medication was prescribed by specialists. We have protocols. The maid held up a hand, calm but firm. I know, she said, but I also know what happens when you give someone too much of the wrong thing. I've seen it before. Dongsun's eyes narrowed. Seen it where? He asked. The maid hesitated for a moment. Then she spoke quietly. In homes like this, she said, where people are treated like possessions. The doctor's face tightened. He didn't like the implication, but he couldn't deny the numbers. The mother's vitals were stable. For the first time in weeks, the maid continued, voice steady. I'm not saying anyone is trying to kill her, she said, but I am saying someone is not trying to save her. Dongsun's eyes burned. He felt the anger rise, but it was mixed with something else, something he didn't like to admit. Relief, because for the first time, there was a reason for the decline. A reason that didn't involve his own weakness. A reason that could be controlled. He turned back to the maid. You replaced the medication, he said. She nodded. With water. He added. She didn't deny it. She simply looked at him. Because I couldn't watch her die, she said. Not when I could do something about it. Dongsun stood very still. He felt the weight of the situation settle in his chest. He could fire her. He could have her removed. He could punish her. But he didn't. Not yet. He looked at his mother again. Her breathing remained steady. Her face was still pale, but she looked peaceful. He felt something in him loosen. Not softness. Not emotion. Control. He stepped closer to the maid and spoke quietly. Keep her alive, he said. The maid blinked. Or what? She asked. Dongsun's eyes remained locked on hers. I'll deal with the rest, he said. The doctor watched the exchange with a mix of confusion and fear. The nurse looked away, as if she couldn't bear to see what was happening. The maid remained calm. She understood the meaning behind his words. He wasn't threatening her. He was warning everyone in the room that he was the one who decided what happened next. He was reminding them that he still controlled the world. But for the first time, he also admitted something he had never admitted before. He needed her. The hallway outside the medical suite was silent in a way that felt deliberate. Not empty. Not calm. Deliberate. Like the building itself was holding its breath. Dongsun had returned to his office after the morning confrontation, leaving the maid inside with the silent instruction to keep his mother alive. He didn't know it yet, but the moment he stepped away, the real danger began, because it wasn't the streets that threatened him. It was the people closest to him, the ones who lived inside his walls, the ones who knew how to make a man bleed without lifting a finger. The maid was moving quietly through the corridor, checking the door lock and adjusting the curtains, doing the same routine she had been doing for days. But something felt different. The air felt thicker. She could sense eyes watching, not from the cameras, from the shadows. She turned the corner and stopped. Standing there, as if she'd been waiting, was Mrs. Kang Dongsun's stepmother. She was dressed in a designer suit that looked like it had been stitched from money. Her hair was perfectly styled. Her posture was immaculate. Her smile was calm, but her eyes were cold, like someone who had never needed to raise her voice to get what she wanted. The maid stopped. Her heart beat faster. She didn't know what Mrs. Kang wanted, but she knew what it meant when a woman like that appeared in a hallway like this. It meant she had already decided the outcome. Mrs. Kang took a step forward. Ah, she said softly. You must be the new caretaker. The maid nodded, keeping her face neutral. Yes, she said quietly. Mrs. Kang's smile didn't change. She looked the maid up and down, like a judge reviewing a file. You're doing well, she said, tone polite. The maid didn't respond. Mrs. Kang continued. I've heard you have been very attentive, she said. The maid's jaw tightened. She knew what that meant. It meant she was being watched. Mrs. Kang stepped closer. Her voice lowered. You know, in this house, we appreciate loyalty, she said. The maid nodded again. Yes. Mrs. Kang's smile deepened. But loyalty has a price. The maid's eyes narrowed slightly. She understood the meaning. Mrs. Kang continued, voice calm. You're far from home, she said. You have no family here, no one to defend you, no one to protect you. The maid didn't blink. Mrs. Kang reached out and touched the maid's shoulder, light and casual. It was the kind of touch that was meant to be comforting, but it felt like a warning. Mrs. Kang leaned closer, her voice quiet. You should be careful, she said. The maid's throat tightened. Mrs. Kang spoke again. Your visa, your paperwork. It can be complicated, she said. The maid's blood ran cold. She had heard this before. This was how threats were made in places like this. Not with guns. With paperwork. With control. With the ability to make someone disappear legally. Mrs. Kang continued, voice soft. Sometimes people don't realize how quickly things can change, she said. How fast a simple mistake can become a problem. The maid didn't speak. Mrs. Kang's smile remained. She stepped back slightly. Then she spoke in a tone that was almost sweet. You should not speak to Mr. Dong-sun about the medicine, she said. It's not your place. The maid's eyes hardened. I'm here to care for your mother, she said. Mrs. Kang's smile didn't change, but her eyes did. They sharpened. You are here to do what you're told, she said. The maid's voice was steady. I'm here to keep her alive, she said. Mrs. Kang nodded slowly, like she was considering something. Then she said, quietly, good. The maid felt her stomach drop, because she knew that word meant something else. It meant, you've been warned. Mrs. Kang stepped closer again, and her voice dropped even lower. Remember, she said, you are replaceable. The maid didn't move. Mrs. Kang continued, people like you don't last long in this house, she said. The maid's face remained calm, but inside, she felt the pressure building. Mrs. Kang leaned in one last time. Her voice was soft. Don't forget, she said. I know where your family is. I know what your father owes. I know everything. The maid's breath caught. She knew the name of her father. She knew the debt. She knew the danger. She had thought she could hide. She had thought she could survive. But now she realized something terrifying. The threat wasn't outside. It was inside the walls. Mrs. Kang stepped back. She smiled once more, bright and polite. Take care of my mother, she said. Then she turned and walked away. The maid stood alone in the hallway. Her hands were shaking. She swallowed hard. She knew she had to keep her composure, because if she showed fear, it would be used against her. She turned toward the medical suite. The door was closed. Her mother's breathing was steady inside, but the maid knew the truth. The clock was ticking. Every day she kept the mother alive, she became more dangerous to the people who wanted her dead. Every day she stayed, she risked losing everything. Her visa, her freedom, her life, and she knew the worst part. She couldn't tell Dong Sunday. Not yet, because if she told him, he would act. And if he acted, the consequences would ripple. It would expose the real enemy. And that was something she couldn't risk. So she did the only thing she could do. She went back into the room. She closed the door, and she began to prepare, because the next threat wasn't a stranger. It was someone who lived in the same building. Someone who had power. Someone who could ruin her without ever raising a hand. And now, the maid was not only fighting to keep a woman alive, she was fighting to stay alive herself. The night after the hallway confrontation, the penthouse felt different. Not quieter, not calmer, just heavier, like the building itself was waiting for something to happen. The maid moved through the corridors with the kind of careful precision you only see in people who have already survived something that could have killed them. She was no longer just a caretaker. She was a survivor. And the truth was this. The moment she refused to obey the medicine schedule, the game changed. Because now the people who wanted the mother to die had a new problem, a new variable, a person who knew the truth, a person who could expose them, a person who could make the boss look weak. And in that world, weakness was not allowed. Not in the streets, not in the family, not in the penthouse. The maid started her night shift like a surgeon preparing for a risky operation. She washed her hands until her skin tightened. She checked the mother's IV line, even though it wasn't supposed to be touched. She checked the vitals again. Then again, then again. She was doing more than care. She was creating a trail, a record, a pattern, something that could prove her innocence if she was ever accused. She checked the medicine cabinet. Everything looked normal. But she didn't trust appearances anymore. She emptied every container, checked every label, and resealed them. Then she took the prescribed medication and placed it in a locked box. Not because she trusted it, because she didn't. She replaced the bottles with water. She labeled the water carefully. She recorded everything in her own notebook, the kind of notes a nurse would take when she was the only one who cared. Then she sat on the edge of the bed, and she listened. Not to the machines, to the silence that spoke louder than any alarm. She could feel it. Someone was watching, not the cameras. Something else. A presence. A shadow. The sense of eyes in the dark. She didn't look at the cameras. She didn't need to. She could feel the danger. She had learned to read fear, because fear had been her teacher. In his surveillance room, Dong-sun sat behind the glass. The screens showed the mother's room in crisp detail, but the screens didn't show what he was feeling. The screens didn't show the way his chest tightened when he saw her checking the medicine again. They didn't show the way his mind raced. They didn't show the way he could feel her fear. He had watched the maid from the beginning. He had watched her refuse the protocol. He had watched her take the risk. But now, he watched her in a new way. He watched her as a man watches someone he's beginning to trust. He watched her as a man watches a woman who could be his salvation, or his downfall. He noticed the changes, the way she checked the door before she moved, the way she didn't leave the room unless she had to, the way she always kept her back to the wall. He saw the signs of paranoia, the same signs he saw in men who had been hunted, the same signs he saw in people who knew the system could swallow them whole. And he realized something. She wasn't afraid of him. She was afraid of what he couldn't control. He wasn't the only one watching. He could feel it. He could sense it the way you sense a storm before the wind hits. The cameras were on, but the cameras weren't the only eyes in the building. There were other eyes, the kind that didn't need lenses, the kind that had been trained to watch without being seen. He knew because he had used those eyes. He knew how the people who worked for him could be bought, how they could be turned, how they could be sent in like ghosts. He knew because he had done it himself. He knew the danger, and he knew the only way to protect her. He had to become the thing she feared. He had to become the guard, the watchman, the shadow in the hallway. That night, Dong-sun did something he had not done in years. He left his office. He walked through the corridors. He didn't announce himself. He didn't knock. He didn't speak. He simply walked to the hallway outside the mother's room. He moved a leather chair into place. Not for comfort, for control. He sat down, and he waited. He placed a knife on the armrest. Not hidden, not discreet. Visible. A warning. A promise. If someone tried to enter the room, they would have to pass through him first. The chair sat in the hallway like a sentry. The knife glinted in the dim light. He didn't look at the camera feed anymore. He didn't need to. He could feel the danger. He could hear it. He could smell it. And he made a decision. If anyone wanted the mother dead, they would have to go through him. And he was ready. The maid moved silently through the room. She checked the locks. She checked the window. She checked the medicine. She checked the bed. Then she heard something outside. A footstep. A pause. A breath. She froze. She didn't turn. She didn't move. She waited. And then she heard it. The sound of someone sitting down. A chair settling. A knife being placed. And a voice, low and steady, like a gunshot. Let them come. What time is it where you're watching from right now? The penthouse was built like a fortress. Marble walls. Steel locks. Security systems layered like armor. And yet, in the middle of the night, it all went dark. Not a flicker. Not a warning. A clean, absolute cut. The kind of blackout that doesn't happen by accident. The kind that happens when someone has planned for it. When someone has decided to make the world go quiet. When someone has decided to take control. The first sign was the silence. The hum of machines stopped. The monitors went black. The tiny beeps that had been the heartbeat of the mother's room vanished like a knife through water. Then, the emergency lights flickered on. A harsh red glow. The kind of light that makes everything look like a crime scene. The maid was inside the room when the lights changed. She was sitting beside the bed, holding the mother's hand. Her thumb moved in slow circles on the back of the older woman's palm. It was a gesture of comfort, a gesture of human touch. The kind of touch no doctor had ever given. No nurse, no caregiver, not in that house. The maid looked up as the emergency lights turned on. Her eyes narrowed. She felt it. The moment the lights switched, she knew something had changed. Not just the power. The balance. She stood up slowly. Her hands moved to the bedside table. She checked the oxygen machine. Dead. The ventilator. Dead. The monitors. Dead. The mother's breathing was still there, but it was shallow. A sound that was too quiet. A sound that was too weak. The maid's heart began to race. She had trained for emergencies, but she had never trained for a blackout in a penthouse built like a prison. She reached for the backup equipment. The emergency generator should have kicked in. It didn't. She swallowed hard. She didn't have time to panic. She had to act. She grabbed a flashlight. The beam cut through the red light. She moved to the mother's face. Checked her airway. Checked her pulse. The mother's lips were dry. Her skin was cold. The maid's hands moved with controlled urgency. She pulled the mother's head back slightly. She began rescue breathing. 1 breath. 2 breaths. She counted silently. 3. 4. Her body shook. But she didn't stop. She kept breathing for her. She kept the rhythm. She kept her alive. And she knew something else. This wasn't a medical emergency. This was an attack. Because no one could have caused a blackout in a building like this without inside access. No one. In the hallway outside the room, Dong-sun felt the darkness like a punch to the chest. He had been sitting in his chair, waiting, watching, listening. He had felt the danger coming. He had sensed the shift. And now, it had happened. He stood. His hand moved to his gun. He moved toward the mother's room with the quiet confidence of a man who had survived 100 fights. He didn't rush. He didn't panic. He didn't show fear. Because fear was a weakness he couldn't afford. He reached the door. The lock was still in place, but the silence was wrong. The building was too quiet. He pressed his ear to the door. He heard nothing. Not the mother's breathing. Not the maid's voice. Nothing. He opened the door. The emergency lights threw a red glow across the room. The maid was there, breathing into the mother's mouth. Her eyes were wide. Her face was pale, but she was moving. She was working. She was alive. Dong-sun stepped inside. The smell hit him first. The smell of fear. The smell of blood. The smell of oil and old medicine. He didn't speak. He didn't ask. He watched. Then he saw it. The mother's oxygen line was off. The machine was dead. The room was in chaos. He understood immediately. This wasn't a malfunction. It was sabotage. His heart hardened. He looked at the maid. She was still breathing for the mother. Her face was wet with sweat. Her hands were shaking. But she wasn't stopping. Dong-sun moved beside her. He didn't touch her. He didn't speak. He simply watched her work. He realized, in that moment, that she was more dangerous than he had imagined. Not because she was a threat to him, but because she was a threat to the people who had been poisoning the mother. Because she had discovered the truth. Because she was not going to back down. Outside the room, in the hallway, footsteps moved. Soft, quiet, professional, the sound of trained men. Men who didn't belong to Dong-sun. Men who belonged to someone else. Someone with access. Someone with power. Dong-sun's eyes narrowed. He moved to the door. His hand went to the deadbolt. He locked it. Then he turned to face the hallway. He pulled his gun from his holster. He stood in the doorway. The red emergency lights painted his face in harsh strokes. His suit was torn. His hair was messy. His eyes were fierce. He looked like a man who had already been through war. He raised his gun. And he waited. The first man stepped forward. He didn't speak. He didn't hesitate. He moved like a soldier. Dong-sun fired. The sound was loud in the quiet hallway. The first man dropped. The second man moved forward. Dong-sun fired again. The third man took cover. Dong-sun moved forward, stepping into the hallway. He fired again. The hallway filled with smoke and the sharp smell of gunpowder. The sound of bodies hitting the floor echoed down the corridor. He was fighting, but he wasn't fighting for power. He was fighting for a woman's life. He was fighting for his mother. He was fighting for the truth. Back inside the room, the maid continued rescue breathing. Her arms ached. Her lungs burned. But she kept going. The mother's chest rose slightly, then fell. The maid felt a moment of hope, but then the mother's breathing became irregular. A cough. A choke. The mother's eyes fluttered open. She looked at the maid. Her gaze was weak, but it was clear. She was alive. The maid's eyes filled. She wanted to cry, but she couldn't. Not yet. Not while the fight was still happening outside. She looked toward the door. She could hear gunfire. She could hear the sounds of bodies falling. She could hear Dong Sun fighting for them. She knew he was risking his life. She knew the danger was real. And then the door burst open. The maid spun around. The gun was in her hand. She raised it. Her hand shook. She didn't know how to aim. She didn't know how to fire. She didn't know how to kill. But she knew this. She would not let anyone harm the mother. She would not let anyone harm the truth. She would not let anyone take her life. The intruder stepped into the room. His face was hidden. His posture was confident. He was not afraid. He was certain. He raised his own weapon. The maid's heart raced. She squeezed the trigger. The gun clicked. Nothing. She looked down. The gun was empty. She had forgotten to check. She had forgotten everything in the panic. The intruder stepped closer. The maid's breath caught. She knew she was about to die. She knew she had no choice. And then the intruder's face appeared. It was Dong Sun. Blood on his suit. A cut on his forehead. His eyes wide. He was breathing heavily. He stepped between the maid and the intruder. The intruder froze. He looked at Dong Sunday. And then he backed away. Because the boss had arrived. Because the boss had taken control. Because the boss had become the barrier between life and death. The power came back like a punch. A sudden, violent return of electricity that slammed into the room in one brutal wave. The emergency lights blinked out. The overhead lights snapped on. The monitors flickered, then stabilized. The beeping returned steady, relentless, like a heartbeat that refused to die. The mother's chest rose and fell in a calmer rhythm. The machines were alive again. The room filled with the sterile smell of disinfectant and warmed plastic. The maid stood beside the bed, shaking. Her hands were trembling so hard the flashlight in her grip wobbled. She had been holding her breath for what felt like hours. Her eyes stayed on the mother's face. She watched for any sign of collapse. She listened for any sign of death. When the monitor beeped in a regular cadence, she let her breath out. It came out like a sob she didn't allow herself to make. She leaned forward. She pressed her forehead against the mother's hand. A silent moment, a private relief. The mother's eyes fluttered open again, not fully awake, not fully aware, but awake enough to recognize the presence in the room. The maid's lips moved in a whisper. "Stay with me." She didn't know if the mother could hear, but she spoke anyway, because words were all she had left, because silence was not enough. The door opened slowly. Dong Sun stepped in. His suit was torn. Blood streaked across his shirt. A deep cut on his forehead had been bandaged quickly, but the red stain still seeped through. He looked like a man who had walked through fire. And he had. The maid turned. Her eyes widened. She had expected him to be furious. She had expected him to fire her. She had expected him to take everything away. But he didn't look angry. He looked exhausted. He looked hollow. He looked like a man who had been stripped of his control. He looked like a man who had almost lost the one thing he couldn't replace. Dong Sun walked toward the bed. He didn't look at the maid. He looked at his mother. He placed his hand on the bed rail. He stared at the monitors. He listened to the beeping. He didn't move for a moment. His breathing was heavy. Then he looked at the maid. Her eyes were wet. Her face was pale. She had been holding herself together with pure force. He could see it. He could see the fear in her. He could see the relief. He could see the truth that had just saved his mother's life. Dong Sun's voice was low. "Are you okay?" The maid blinked. She wasn't sure what to say. Her throat felt dry. Her mouth was full of the taste of fear. She shook her head. "No." Dong Sun nodded. Not as a comfort, as a fact. He took a step closer. He stared at the maid for a long moment. Then he said, quietly, "You did what you had to do." The maid's shoulders sagged. She swallowed. "You could have fired me." Dong Sun didn't answer immediately. He looked at his mother again. The mother's breathing was stable. The color in her face was returning. Her eyes opened wider. She looked at her son. Her expression was weak, but she was aware. She smiled slightly. A tiny movement, like a fragile promise. Dong Sun's eyes softened. For a second, the boss disappeared. A son remained. He moved closer to the bed. He reached for his mother's hand. He held it. He didn't say anything. The room was quiet. The only sound was the monitor's steady beep. The maid stood still, watching. She didn't move. She didn't speak. She simply stayed in the room. She didn't leave. She didn't run. She didn't hide. Because she knew she had just crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. She had risked her life. She had risked her future. She had risked everything. And she had saved the woman who had raised the man who ruled the streets. Dong Sun's voice cut through the silence. I want to know everything. The maid's eyes widened. Everything? He nodded. He didn't ask politely. He didn't ask like a man requesting information. He asked like a man demanding truth. She swallowed. Then she spoke. She told him what she had seen. She told him what she had smelled. She told him what she had tasted. She told him what she knew. And as she spoke, Dong Sun listened. Not as a boss. Not as a gangster. As a son. As a man who had been lied to. As a man who had just realized the people closest to him were the ones who wanted him dead. When she finished, Dong Sun stood still. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He just stared. Then he looked back at the mother. His voice was calm, but his eyes were dangerous. You keep her alive. He turned back to the maid. I'll deal with the rest. The maid nodded. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. She understood. She had just been given a place in a world where no one trusted anyone. A world where loyalty was paid in blood. A world where survival meant knowing when to disobey. And in that moment, in the quiet of the room, the three of them shared a single truth. The mother was alive. The boss was wounded. And the maid had changed everything. Would you have trusted her or fired her? The morning after the blackout was calm in a way that felt unnatural. Seoul's skyline glowed outside the penthouse windows. The city moved like it always did, cars humming, vendors shouting, life continuing as if nothing had happened. But inside the building, the air was heavy. A quiet tension hung in the hallways, like the calm after a storm. When the world is waiting for the next thunder, Dong Sun moved through the penthouse without making a sound. His footsteps were measured. His expression was blank. He didn't look like a man who had just survived an attack. He looked like a man who was about to respond. He went to the security room. The screens were back online. The cameras were all functioning. But Dong Sun didn't watch the footage. He didn't need to. He already knew. He already knew who had been inside. He already knew who had access. He already knew who had betrayed him. He turned to the head of security. Who came in last night? The man hesitated. He didn't speak. He swallowed. Then he answered, 3 men. They came through the service corridor. They had access codes. Dong Sun's jaw tightened. Who gave them the codes? The man's eyes flicked toward the floor. Someone inside. Dong Sun nodded. He didn't ask more. He didn't need to. He knew. He knew the traitor was closer than anyone wanted to admit. He walked down the hallway toward the private clinic wing. The doctors were there. They stood in the corridor like obedient soldiers. Their faces were pale. Their hands were still shaking. They had seen the boss in a state they had never seen before. They had seen him vulnerable. And they hated it. They had been part of the plan. They had been part of the poison. They had been part of the slow killing. They had been part of the betrayal. Dong Sun walked up to the lead doctor. The man's name was Park. He was young, confident. He had been hired for his reputation, for his skill, for his willingness to obey. Dong Sun looked at him. He didn't speak. He simply stared. The silence was heavy. Then Dong Sun said, "Your services are no longer required." Park's eyes widened. He tried to speak. He tried to argue, but the words didn't come. Dong Sun's voice was calm. "Leave." Park nodded. He turned and walked away, not out of respect, out of fear. The other doctors were dismissed in the same way. No shouting, no threats, no drama, just quiet removal. The kind of removal that meant the boss didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need to show anger. He simply removed what was broken. He removed what was poisonous. He removed what was dangerous. The staff in the penthouse began to disappear, not in a dramatic scene, not in a public spectacle, just quietly, one by one. The ones who had been in the room the night of the blackout, the ones who had been part of the plan, the ones who had been willing to kill for money, they were gone. No police, no court, no trial, just disappearance. Because in Dong Sun's world, justice was not performed in public. It was done quietly. It was done efficiently. It was done without mercy. The traitor wasn't just a doctor. It was someone deeper, someone who had access to the house, someone who knew the routine, someone who knew the codes, someone who had been trusted. Dong Sun didn't need to interrogate. He didn't need to threaten. He simply let the system work. His men found the traitor, a trusted aide, a man who had been with the family for years, the kind of man who smiled in the hallways, the kind of man who held doors open, the kind of man who spoke politely, The kind of man who made people feel safe. The traitor was taken. Not publicly. Not with a scene. Not with a fight. Just quietly. His disappearance was noted. His absence was felt. But no one spoke of him. No one asked where he went. Because everyone understood. When Dong Sun decided someone was dangerous, they simply ceased to exist. The penthouse returned to its cold normality. The cameras continued to watch. The staff continued to obey. The doctors were replaced. New ones arrived. More loyal. More cautious. More afraid. Dong Sun stood in the hallway and watched the new staff move through the building. He didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He didn't feel victorious. He felt the weight of what had happened. He felt the cost. He felt the truth. That the people closest to him had tried to kill his mother, and he had found out because a quiet maid had broken the rules. He walked back toward the mother's room. He didn't speak to anyone. He didn't need to. The message had been sent. The threat had been neutralized. The price had been paid. The boss was still in control, but something had changed. The world was quieter now, and the silence was louder than ever. The penthouse felt different, not because the walls had changed, not because the furniture had been rearranged, not because the cameras had been removed. It felt different because the air was no longer heavy with fear. It was lighter, almost human. The first thing that confirmed the change was the absence of the cameras. Dong Sun had ordered them removed. Not just turned off, removed. No more hidden eyes. No more silent watchers. No more constant surveillance. The surveillance room was empty. The screens were blank. The wires were cut. The monitors were gone. The security team still existed, but they were no longer stationed in the same way. They were no longer watching the mother's room like it was a crime scene. The mother's room had become just a room again, a place for healing, a place for rest, a place for life. The mother was still weak, still fragile, but she was alive, and she was recovering, slowly, not in the way doctors had promised, not in the way the family had demanded, but in the way life insisted. Day by day, hour by hour, the maid was still there, not as a temporary worker, not as a quiet ghost. She was now part of the house, part of the family. Her movements were no longer hidden. Her presence was no longer ignored. She walked through the halls with the same calm precision, but now people looked at her differently. They didn't look away. They didn't pretend she wasn't there. They respected her. They feared her less. They understood that she was not a threat. She was a protector. Dong Sun watched from a distance, not like a boss, like a man. He watched her gently adjust the mother's pillows. He watched her check the medicine cabinet. He watched her move the blanket over the mother's legs. He watched the way she spoke softly, not to the staff, not to the doctors, but to the woman who had raised him. He realized that the world he had built with fear had been broken by something simple. The mother's recovery was slow, but it was real. The color returned to her cheeks. The breathing became easier. The strength returned to her hands. And the more she improved, the more Dong Sun felt something inside him shift. Not the hunger for power, not the need for control. Something else. A quiet truth he had ignored for years. That love was not weakness. That vulnerability did not mean danger. That trust did not equal betrayal. He stood in the doorway of the mother's room one afternoon. The maid was there. The mother was asleep. Sunlight fell through the window, warming the bedspread. The air smelled faintly of tea and disinfectant. Dong Sun stepped inside. He didn't sit. He didn't speak. He simply watched. The maid looked up. Her eyes met his. For a moment, there was silence. No fear. No respect. Just a shared understanding. She didn't bow. She didn't lower her eyes. She simply nodded. A small gesture. A gesture of acceptance. Dong Sun walked closer. He placed his hand on the bed rail. He looked at his mother. He looked at the maid. He spoke softly. "Thank you." The maid didn't respond immediately. Her face remained still. Her eyes were guarded, but the tension in her shoulders eased. She knew the words were sincere. She knew he meant them. She nodded again. Then she returned to her work. She adjusted the mother's blanket. She checked her pulse. She whispered to the mother like she was speaking to someone who could hear. Dong Sun watched. He felt the old version of himself fading, not disappearing, but shifting. The boss was still there, but now he was more than a boss. He was a son, a man who had learned the cost of control, a man who had learned the value of trust. The cameras were gone. The fear was gone. The silence was gone. and in its place was something he had never allowed himself to feel before. Hope. The story ends the way it began. In a room lit by surveillance, not by sunlight, not by warmth, but by a small, cold camera light, a blinking red dot that promised to record everything, to expose everything, to keep the truth trapped in a loop of watchful eyes. The final scene isn't a dramatic confrontation. It isn't a courtroom. It isn't a confession. It's a simple frame, a screenshot from the first night. The camera angle is low, capturing the mother's bed and the maid beside it. The maid's hand is on the mother's hand, not holding it like a nurse, not holding it like an employee, holding it like a person. The mother's face is peaceful for the first time in weeks. The maid's face is calm. Her expression is quiet, not triumphant, not relieved, just present. The camera light is visible in the corner of the frame. A reminder that someone had been watching, a reminder that someone had tried to control the truth, a reminder that the boss had been blind to what was happening in his own house. The surveillance room is empty now. The screens are dark, the wires are gone, the cameras are removed, but the image remains, a silent witness to what happened. The night control failed. The night the system meant to protect became the system that almost destroyed them. The night the boss learned that power was not the same as safety. The night the quiet maid did what no one else dared. She disobeyed. She acted. She chose truth over fear. She chose life over loyalty to a broken system. And in doing so, she changed everything. Not just for the mother, not just for the boss, for the entire house, for the entire legacy, for the way the story would be remembered. Because the truth survived. The cameras were removed. The threat was eliminated. The boss remained in control. But the world inside that penthouse was no longer ruled by fear. It was ruled by something else. Something quieter. Something more dangerous. Trust. And the knowledge that sometimes the most powerful act in the world is to simply do what is right. Where are you watching from and what's the weather like there?